Hello, my name is Sridhar Rangayan. I'm the Festival Director of Kashish Mumbai International Queer Film Festival, which is having its 12th edition right now. And today we're going to be discussing a wonderful film called Once a Fury, directed by Jacqueline Rhodes. It's a documentary profiling former members of the Furies, a notorious 1970s lesbian separatist collective that published a national newspaper and planned to seize state power. And thank you for joining us, Jackie. And the host of the Q&A today is DHAMINI RATNAM, who is a journalist, and she hosts a podcast called Gender Question. She is interested in the intersection of contemporary history, feminism, and rise of people's movement, such as the one that emerged to challenge the colonial law that criminalized same-sex desire in India. Thankfully, that section 377 is gone, read down and dusted. But right now, we are going to be talking about basically equal marriage rights, etc. It's a long challenge ahead for us. And Dhamini, thank you for championing the particular cause. So over to you, Dhamini, for the Q&A.
Thank you, Sridhar, and welcome, Jackie. I must say I've watched this film like a couple of times now, and every single watching has actually brought so much more to my attention. With every time I've seen it, there's something else that comes to the fore. So I'd really like to just start with tracing original members of the Fury, a group that existed, like 40 years ago. Can you just tell us a little bit about what was that like? How did you manage to track them down? Did you have any difficulty? Did they want to sort of speak? And why only 10 out of the 12 and why not all the 12?
Well, one of them unfortunately had passed already, and one did not want to be interviewed. That was Jeb, or Joan Byron, but she actually contributed to the film quite heavily in letting me use photographs that she had taken of the Furies 50 years ago. So I did interviews with everybody who's still with us, except for Jeb, who let me use her photographs. And so I actually had participation from everybody that was possible. But when I started out, it was easy to track down a couple of the Furies because one of them, Charlotte Bunch, is a professor and a speaker on international women's rights. And I had seen her speak at a university. So I had an email address, and it was sort of this cold call where I just sort of emailed and said, so I'm doing this project and I would love to talk to you. And she got me in contact with one or two other Furies. And then another Fury, Sharon Devi, I tracked down because I found a trace reference to her in a blog post by somebody else. And so I emailed the blog author and said, can you send this to Sharon Devi? And so there was a lot of that sort of thing too. A little bit of internet sleuthing. And then also, as soon as I got hold of 3 or 4 of them, then they would put me in contact with more. And so eventually I was in contact with everybody. The most difficult one to get in contact with actually was Rita Mae Brown, because she's a well-known author, and the only way I could get a hold of her was through her publicist. And so I was emailing the publicist, hoping that this would get sent on to her. And it did, but she doesn't do email, and she doesn't have a TV, and she doesn't have a computer. She does everything on an old typewriter. And so it was hard. We were doing snail mail back and forth. But eventually I got an interview with her too. And that was the last interview that I did. So it took about 3 or 4 years to get all the interviews.
Right. So you in the film itself, you start by talking about, how you, when you first came out, your first girlfriend gave you the, like a whole bunch of the Furies newspapers, right?
Yes.
Is that when the seed for, sort of wanting to research more about them came about? What started it? I mean, was it the newspapers?
It was the newspapers, definitely, because I saw those newspapers. I read them a lot over and over and over again, and I still find them relevant now. There's some stuff that seems dated and other stuff that you read and you're like, yep, still true, still true, still true. So it really resonated with me. It wasn't until I got my PhD and finished my dissertation, and my first book was on radical feminist manifestos. And so then I remembered, the Furies newspapers, maybe that will be my second book, because this newspaper was so important and was so widely read, at least in the US, among lesbian feminists, that it seemed like this significant thing that somebody needed to document. Well, then I kept trying to write the book, and it just didn't happen. I had writer's block for probably 10 years. I just could not write the book. And it was this moment about 4 or 5 years ago when I realized they're still alive. You could talk to them and you could have them tell their stories. And that would actually be more interesting and more powerful than just another academic book on a feminist topic.
Yeah. And what I find so interesting in the film also is how we see traces of you, literally see traces of you in the film, like, you know, a shadow or a reflection of your knee when you're interviewing them. And it seems like a really personal film, but at the same time, you know, you seem mostly behind the camera, out of it. You know, you focus even the framing of each of these members of the Fury. I mean, it's such a tight frame. I mean, tell us a little bit about, walk us through the choice of, you know, how you decided to make this film, this documentary film, because it is clearly personal. So yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm in there because clearly I'm making the choices about doing the frame in that particular way. I'm in there, but I wanted to be more of a cipher than anything else, because I felt this is their story. I mean, it's partially my story, and it's the story of any lesbian who came out in the 80s or 90s and read the newspapers and wondered whatever happened to the Furies. It's that sort of story. But the story of the Furies themselves needed to come from the women themselves, because they were so passionate about what they believed. And it was a very, I think I say in the film, it was a very intense collective. They came together very intensely, and then they just sort of blew apart very intensely. I would talk to them and think, oh my God, I can't remember what I was doing in my 20s. And so then you talk to somebody who's in their 70s or 80s, and it was 50 years ago, and they're still saying, you know, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And so they were remarkable storytellers. So that made it easy. But my choice was, I want to hear from them. I want to back out of it, and as much as I can have them speak in their own voices. And I see that as a feminist choice, as a feminist filmmaking choice, not to speak over or for somebody, if at all possible. At the same time, you know, I had that personal connection to it, which is just sort of the setup for letting them tell their story.
It's interesting that you talk about the feminist choice here, because what we're really also seeing, what the Furies also were a break away from what was the mainstream feminist movement in the United States. I have a bit of an interest in contemporary people's movements as well. And so there are very sort of contiguous similarities with the Indian lesbian movement, if we can call it that, because the term lesbian itself has been heavily contested within the Indian context. And I mean, there are many moving parts to it. So the importance, therefore, of the Furies, right? The importance of them coming together and practicing the politics of feminism, and the way in which they centralize the political identity. I find that fascinating. And I would love to hear what you think about this, because we tend to think of sexual identity today in much more innate terms, yeah, right? But what the Furies were saying, and in your film also, when they're talking about, you know, their politics at the time, they were talking about why it was important to become a lesbian, right?
Yes.
So the vantage point of lesbianism as being, you know, the vanguard to challenge male supremacy, and, you know, and like they'll join up with all the other vanguards and bring down the patriarchy,
right?
Which is brilliant. And I think I really miss that. I really miss this kind of, you know, coalescing and organizing around the politics. So I'm just curious, what did you have to think about that? I mean, did that resonate with you at all? I mean, I was really struck by it.
It did very much. I mean, I think if you look at that period of feminism in the US, well, especially white feminism, looking back at Simone de Beauvoir and the idea that gender is socially constructed, that very heavy constructionist idea of this is a construction, therefore you can make moves and choices to determine an identity, which is on the one hand very cool, and on the other hand, it's like, but what about embodied realities? And so it's a huge theoretical problem. Now, lesbian feminism in the US in the 70s moved away from that constructivist idea of you can become a lesbian to lesbians are more woman than woman. I mean, it was like essentialist sort of thing. And so theoretically, and as an academic, I find it really fascinating that there are all these debates about constructionism and essentialism going on in non-academic settings. But the politics of it, the idea that regardless of who you are erotically attached to, the choice of being a lesbian gives you a unique vantage point on the patriarchy, because lesbians, according to the Furies in their newspaper, are the most threatening thing to men. Therefore, what the men will respond to is to accuse you of being a lesbian. And if you're just out there saying, yes, I am, so what?
In our pride marches, there used to be one slogan that we used to say, which was, ha, hum to, which translates to, yes, I am, so what you going to do about it? Like, you know.
Exactly. And yeah, and I think that sort of assertion of lesbianism, not saying I am a gay woman, but I am a lesbian, and that's different from the gay rights movement, and that's separate from the women's liberation movement, that it's a unique liberation movement, and that the window that lesbians have on the patriarchy is telling and unique.
Does the idea of sexual identity, which is now innate and inborn, so we are therefore pre-constituted subjects in some sense, do you think that that actually takes away from the political urgency of what the Furies were really trying to do, which was create a vanguard, create the, you know, that create a politics which was the vantage point?
When you go with the innate theory of sexuality, is you're very often skirting on that idea of essential quality, and it sometimes overdetermines what your politics are supposed to be. And so I tend to put a very strong constructivist bent to it. It's like, well, you know, sexuality may be innate. We may be born this way, as Lady Gaga would say. But whether or not we choose to act or be political in certain ways is still part of a sexual identity. When straight people will say, well, I don't care who you sleep with, blah, 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 blah. It's like, but it's so much more than that. It's so much more than the erotic entanglement. It's also the politics. And so it does change. It does change the political ability if you see it purely as innate and not also constructed.
Yeah. Okay, so let's shift back a little bit to the filmmaking. I'm curious about how many hours of footage did you collect?
19. I counted because I was in there with it. I mean, you've watched the movie twice. I've watched the movie probably 400 times at this point, just going over and over and over it, and piecing it together. Yeah, 19 hours of footage.
Okay.
Lots of emails back and forth, because at the end, when I was putting together the different drafts, I actually was sending the drafts to the Furies themselves and soliciting their feedback, because I saw that as another instance of a sort of feminist approach to filmmaking where I'm not speaking for them. It's like, this is how I heard you tell your story. This is how I'm going to present your story. Do you think that it's accurate enough? Does it tell the story the way that you want it to be told? And so there was that at the same time as I have my own sort of directorial view of how the story should be put together. But sifting through 19 hours to get it to the final 83 minutes was a chore. It was a difficult thing. I mean, I had a couple of drafts before the final one that were very different. And I got feedback and ended up ditching, you know, half an hour that I thought should have been in the movie, and it's not in the movie now.
So, okay, so tell us a little bit about what you wanted to include, but, you know, what eventually got left out.
The main thing that I wish that I had time to put in were the sort of origin stories of each of them, because these are fascinating people. You know, you have Nancy Myron, who worked with voters' rights in the Deep South in the 60s. And you have Tasha Peterson, whose father was one of the Chicago Seven, who talked a lot about that. And then you have Helene Harris, who had worked with all sorts of anti-imperialist, anti-war efforts in Cuba. And so you have all these people coming from all sorts of different activist backgrounds. It would have been a very different movie. I could make an entire movie on that, just to say, here, they all came together.
Yeah.
What that boiled down to was just saying, here are some snapshots of where they came from, and they all had serious activist cred. I started out with, half an hour of them just telling stories of getting together. And then it was like, okay, this movie cannot be 5 hours long. I mean, I need to get to the point of, and now they're the Furies, and what are they doing?
Right. Yeah, that's a good choice and decision, because I think that your film really does delve into what really they were. What were they doing? What does it mean to be a separatist group? And I thought it was very sweet, although I'm pretty sure that that's not how they intended it. But it was very sweet how they were talking about, we had all these grand plans of taking down the state. And then, there's this moment of silence, but like, we don't really know how you're going to do that. How do you take down the state? I thought that was very, very cute.
Each one of them would talk about that. And at different times they would say, we were so arrogant. I mean, we were in our teens and early 20s. And the oldest Fury at the time was, I think, 25 or 26. And you think, here are 18, 19, 20-year-olds planning a state overthrow. And they're not sure how to go about doing it, but they're pretty sure it needs to happen. Part of it's the spirit of the times, but yeah, they were committed.
It's great that they were so committed, because I mean, this is exactly what they did. They ended up really, changing the way we really think about women's rights and women-identified women. I think that idea of the woman-identified woman is it's revolutionary. But one thing that really interests me in these interviews is how honest they are, talking about some of the things that they maybe should have done differently, the things that they didn't do. So, for instance, that the fact that there were no Black women in their group, right? I'm also curious about, whether there was any discussion on gender identities, although maybe this is a bit, this probably predates a lot of the conversations about trans identities, but was there something that, came up in the discussions around that? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Not so much in the discussions. I mean, what was interesting, I do find it interesting that they were so able and willing to reflect honestly on what had gone wrong and what their shortcomings were. And part of it, with the idea of, there were no Black women in there, and yet they had been inspired by the Black Panthers. And in Washington, D.C. had a very active African-American civil rights group, right? And the different members of the Furies before they were the Furies had worked with those groups, but they didn't bring it into the Furies themselves. So that was interesting. In terms of gender identity, it does predate a lot of the discussions that we have now. But I do think one of the things that has been very unfortunate in feminism that developed out of the 60s and 70s is you have a lot of people now who identify as feminists who are actually very trans-exclusive feminists. And I know that the shorthand now is TERF, right? The trans-exclusive radical feminist. But I tend to resist that because I don't find the trans-exclusive feminist to be particularly radical, right? So it's not accurate. It's actually very much part and parcel of fairly standard thinking about gender. But the trans-exclusive women who come from the 60s and 70s, huge problem. And it's a problem with our history. And it's a history that we need not look away from, because I think it's part of how feminism developed in the US. I'm not sure about your local context.
We have a Dalit exclusive, caste. So our in India, the context is that we're very casteist as a society. So we have our own non-radical radicals. Yeah.
The non-radical radicals. And I think it's very important. I'm not putting the Furies in this group, but I think that for future projects and stuff, it's very important to look at our histories. It's very important to look at even the ugly histories and say, this is how we got here, and this is still part of who we are. Absolutely. And what are we going to do about it, right? It's that question again. Yes, we are. What are you going to do about it? Yes, you are. What are we going to do about that to change the history and change the present? So yeah, the question of gender identity, I was on a Q&A on another festival and they asked me about the question of bisexuality. And I thought, and that really stumped me because the Furies, I don't think ever commented on bisexuality, because they very much were, you are or you're not. You are a lesbian or you are sleeping with the enemy. It was very black and white in that way. And I think part of it was because they saw it more as the political choice than the erotic entanglement.
Yeah, which is how one of the I think it was Tasha, right, who also talks about how she became a heterosexual afterwards.
Right.
Again, I found that really interesting to sort of put it that way. But I think that you have to really live through the politics to really understand what you mean when you say this. I mean,
yeah. And she says that, and then she'll say, I'm still a woman identified woman.
Yeah.
But I'm heterosexual now. And it's like, okay. So yeah. I think looking at all of them now, most of the Furies are still lesbian, but at different points there was heterosexual activity. I mean, did they identify as heterosexual at that moment? I don't know.
So at least for me, the big takeaway is that when we think about sexual identity, if one really understood that it's not just about who one has sex with, but that it's so much more than that. It's like a whole history. It's an entire political sort of position, right?
Right.
And I think that this film really sort of tells us why it is that. One other thing that I want to sort of to ask you about is this question of children and emotions. I was very struck by how I think it was Charlotte Branch who talked about how they just didn't talk about the emotions of what they felt.
It was Ginny Burson. Ginny Burson says,
it was Ginny Burson.
Yeah.
Sorry, yes,
we just didn't. Yeah, we just didn't.
They just didn't do that, and I think I really want to sort of take a moment here and think about all political movements. Don't do this. They just do not sit down and process just the feelings of what's happening, the psyche, what's going on, right? How did this strike you? I mean, and you're an academic. I mean, so you know so much more about so many other kinds of political formations and organizations. What did this mean when Ginny Burson said that?
The question of children was such a hard one for them, and I really appreciated that they were willing to talk about it, because it was, I think, ultimately what broke up the collective. Because it wasn't just one person or two persons saying, all right, kids have to go. It was a collective decision, and some of the people who made that decision were actually people who had children, but they went along with it and then had profound regrets. And you can still tell 50 years later that it is still a very difficult thing to talk about, and that there are still consequences. I mean, there were relationships with children that were changed forever. So there's that. One of the things I thought was interesting in sort of the larger context of these movements is that very few people would talk to male activists and say, why did you give up your children? But because women are expected to take care of their children, there's still that sort of like, well, you can't be an activist and a mother, but you can be an activist and a father. So there's that sort of at play too. So there's that. But then Ginny Burson has this great moment where she said, we were going to take up arms. We were going to go underground. We were going to start, different cadres around the country. How are we going to take care of children? It was dangerous, but it's all very much in this headspace of what would be dangerous for the children. It's not anything about what are our emotional investments in the children. It's not even when Colita Reed says, I can't believe that we weren't thinking about the next generation.
That was a very powerful statement.
Yeah. So it's like all these things, and a lot of it I chalk up to sort of trying to be too pure, like pure ideology. And that's part of what I was trying to get at in the movie, is that pure ideology is very hard to live. It's very, if not impossible to live. When you are young and a true believer, you want to believe in that ideology and make it affect all of your decisions, from children to shared toothbrushes to shared clothing to, who's going to pay for what. But it turns out that it's just not workable in that way. But that emotional idea, I thought that was a very powerful moment when Ginny Burson said that, when she said, we just didn't talk about them. Now, clearly they had feelings and they felt, but it wasn't part of what they talked about. Part of that might be coming from the intellectual tradition, but part of it, I think, was just a profound failure to acknowledge the relationships between them. And they see it as one of their failures. And I think that's another thing that I was thankful for, that it wasn't, there's no defensiveness in the movie. There's no defensiveness of, this is what we chose and that's just how it was. It was just sort of like, now that I'm reflecting on it, this is what I think. And I think that that's really moving.
Yeah, and that's such a feminist practice. I mean, to sit down and sort of really reflect at the politics and to sort of see how to, or at least that's what I would imagine, feminism would enable you to do, actually.
Oh, I was just going to say, and what I'm hoping to do, I just thought I'd follow up, because I do have these 19 hours of movies.
Right.
That I'm actually planning on cleaning up the full interviews and donating them to a research library so that people can actually see the full interviews, because there's just so much in there, including those origin stories that I was talking about, that is very interesting. And it's a great part of history that people need to know. Especially lesbians need to know their lesbian history. So eventually those are going to find their ways to a library and people can read them or read transcripts and watch the movies. And I'm happy about that.
That's fantastic. So you got funding for this particular project. Was it difficult to get funding for this?
I didn't get a ton of funding. A lot of it was sort of the funding that you get as an academic, professional development. Like, instead of getting funding to go to a conference, I would get funding to go to a library to look at Fury's newspapers. Instead of getting funding for a new computer, I would get funding for a camera. Instead of traveling to a conference, I would travel to do an interview. And so a lot of it was sort of repurposing traditional academic funding and turning it into this sort of movie funding. And I recognize that that's a particular privilege of being a full professor. I'm already tenured, I'm already promoted. I can do that because I've already written books, and this is as far as I can go. But I did get a grant from Michigan State University. It's part of their HARP program that was for $7,000 or $8,000. And that was so helpful because I ended up using it to pay for post-production. I had a very good editor in Pete Johnston, and to pay for some of the music and stuff. But it was largely a shoestring kind of budget. I think the whole thing came in at under $20,000 for the entire movie.
And where has this movie traveled to? Where are you planning to take it to?
In times of COVID, everything is online. So, it's been playing, it played in different French festivals. It's been in 3 different French festivals. It played in the Rainbow Umbrella Festival in the UK. It's played in a number of US festivals, and once in Australia, and now in India. And yeah, so things are happening. It's out there, and I've got it entered in a lot more festivals. Every day I find out that it's been turned down by some, and that makes me sad, and then it gets accepted by some, and that makes me happy. So it's a filmmaker life.
Okay, fantastic. Well, good luck for your next project, and good luck for wherever this whoever gets to see this film. I'm sure people shouldn't be turning this one down. It's really interesting, and it's I think it's been, as a feminist, I can tell you this, that I see this as like a part of my own sort of understanding of history of feminism. So this has been really eye-opening for me too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jackie. It's been wonderful talking to you. And I hope that everybody enjoys the film. And Sridhar, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jackie, for making this wonderful film. And it's a revolution also making the film as much as the revolution was about the Furies. And also thank you for making this full-length interviews available at an archives very soon. And that will be really helpful for sure, for a lot of people who would want to know more about the Furies. And as I said, like, some film festivals will accept the film, some film festivals will not, but your film will live on for sure and go a long way in educating people. And also, Dhamini, really thank you for such a erudite conversation. You're so knowledgeable about everything. So fantastic conversation we have had today. And if you have any questions for Jackie, please put them here in the YouTube comment box or the Facebook comment box, and I'll make sure Jackie sees that and basically responds to it when she sees it. And please do attend the closing award ceremony on September 5th. Online. This year, everything is going to be online per se. So please do that. So thank you, Jackie. Thank you so much, Dhamini, for making this Q&A so wonderful. And I'm so happy that people who have seen the film can enjoy this Q&A and have a more in-depth understanding of the film and the politics of the film.
Thank you.
Thank you.